people throughout the world that have interesting stories to tell. Stories of heroism, acts of kindness, near-death experiences, successes, and failures. You usually hear of these stories from people that live in another state or country. But what about the stories from within your own community? Everyone has a story to tell. And by everyone, we mean your neighbor, your coworker, the person behind you at church, people you interact with on a daily basis, or maybe even you. Welcome to the DTB podcast presented by Bless Your Heart Nonprofit Corporation. I'm Jeray Jambon Jarreau, Director of Bless Your Heart Nonprofit, and filling in for our regular host, Brennan Matherne. It's no secret that our culture is a vital part of who we are. Our parents and grandparents are the individuals who've taught us our way of life, how we speak, our trades, our recipes, and our customs. Our community is comprised of a diverse population: French, Spanish, African American, American Indian, and Creole. It's one of the goals of DTB Podcast to celebrate our culture and our heritage. Today we're sitting down with Jason Pitre, who's a descendant of the United Houma Nation. He's working hard to preserve his family's traditions and heritage. Jason, welcome.
Hello.
So Jason, we're really excited that you're here to talk to us today. So tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, who's your family, who's your mom and dad.
Hello, I'm Jason Pitre, a member of the United Houma Nation. I grew up in Cutoff and later moved to Raceland in my teenage years. My dad's Donald Pitre from Galliano. My mom's former principal chief of the United Houma Nation, Brenda Dardar Robichaud from below Golden Meadow. My stepdad's Dr. Mike Robichaud.
So please share with us a little bit about your affiliation with the United Houma Nation.
So going back, my great-grandfather was Nanes. He was what they called the traiteur. It's like a community doctor or medicine man. My grandmother was Dolores Dardar. She served on the tribal council. My grandfather was Whitney Dardar, a commercial fisherman. He lived the traditional way of life. When he was ill, he took traditional medicines. My mom's Brenda, she was principal chief of the United Houma Nation for 13 years. And she was also in charge of Lafourche Parish Indian education for 30 years. So I grew up just going to council meetings. I was a member of the Bayou Healers youth group. So as a group, we would travel around, do cultural presentations and dance at powwows. I taught at youth camps, at tribal youth camps, where we focused on leadership and cultural enrichment. We would teach things like history, language, dance, crafts, like basket making, blowguns, weaving. And so just being Native has played a tremendous role in helping shape my identity. That's
awesome. Tell us about what you do. What do you do for a living?
So I'm currently have multiple things. I'm a registered nurse and an oysterman. So I became a registered nurse. Just my grandfather had a big influence. He could only go up to the 7th grade due to segregation. So he went to the little settlement school in Golden Meadow, right above the floodgate. And so he couldn't go to school, so he just lived the traditional way of life. Even though he loved school, would have continued on, he couldn't. So, just going off to college was like inevitable. That was an opportunity that I couldn't pass up because just a couple generations ahead of me, they weren't able to do that. So then in college, I just kind of wanted to carry on the legacy of my great-grandfather, Nanes, who was the traiteur. So I would hear stories of how he treated, and then just growing up, I lived with Dr. Mike, and so he would treat people at his house on the weekend, kind of similar to the way Nanes did. So it's like just the history of giving back. So I figured, as a nurse, I can sort of help people, and so I chose that career.
So, Jason, you mentioned that your great-grandfather used to be a traiteur. Can you explain to our listeners who may not know what that is and how they would treat patients?
So, Nanes, my great-grandfather, was, like you said, a traiteur. He was someone who used plants and prayers to heal the sick, and he did it for about 30 years. And it was a time of segregation, but he treated everyone from the community and abroad. People would drive in. I've heard stories as far as Texas to get treated by him. Some people would, at that time, would paddle all day by pirogue to get to him to be treated. And so they had a few treaters on the bayou. Some just specialize in like a handful of things, of ailments, but he was what they called the grand traitement, and he treated every sickness there was. And so some of the local doctors at the time, there were, I guess, two main doctors on the bayou, Dr. Ford and Dr. Gavois. They would sometimes refer patients to him to be treated. At that time, modern medicine really didn't have great treatments for some illnesses, such as like shingles and worms, like when the baby had the worms. Mm-hmm. So they would send those patients to Nines. And he even treated patients in the hospital. People came all hours of the day and night. My grandmother would tell me stories of how parents would bring their baby in like lifeless, and by the time they would leave the house, they were running around, like she said, tearing up her house, like just complete 180.
Wow. And
so at that time, like, or being a treater, you can't accept payment from anyone. So right. He would get donations like groceries or seafood, some sort of non-monetary payment. So he was also a trapper. So his typical day, he would go trapping in the morning, and then while he was trapping, people would start congregating at the house to get treated. And so his wife, they had an operation similar to what we have today when you go to the doctor. His wife would act like a triage nurse. She would kind of organize everybody according to what their illness was, so that way when he came home, like, he could treat more efficiently. And so he would do the treatment, and if a treatment required like a certain herb, his son-in-law would go out to the field or wherever, grab the herb, the root, whatever the treatment required, and then he would send the patient home with like a however long supply of the plant that was required for the treatment.
So, Jason, you mentioned your grandfather, Mr. Whitney Dordor. Can you explain to us, like, what did he do during his lifetime? Like, what was his trade? How did he make a living?
Yeah, so he was a commercial fisherman his whole life. He would say he felt like he never worked a day in his life. He told the story of being out on the water when he's trawling, as he compared it to Christmas. You know, as a kid, you wake up Christmas morning, you know, he's so anxious to see what Santa brought you. Well, when he was trawling, as he was picking up that net, he would feel the same excitement, like to see what the Lord blessed him in his nets with. You know? Wow. So it's just inspiring the love of the trade that he had, and you know, it's something that, like, I love my job, but you know, I don't go to work saying, "Hey, it's Christmas" every day. I can't say I feel like I never felt like I worked a day in my life. You know, so it's really inspiring.
Jason, I understand that your grandfather, a couple of years before he passed away, he had fallen ill for a period of time. Can you share a little bit about that with us?
Yeah, so he was, my father-in-law was at the house, and you know, they were knocking on his door, and he wasn't answering, and you know, like, he's in there, we know he's in there for sure. So then, like, he was in a state where he just he couldn't even stand up. And then, so we took him to Lady of the Sea, and then after lots and lots of tests, we found out he had West Nile. And so he went from being barely able to stand, but he was just determined to get stronger so he could not get stronger and not give up, you know, to get back out on the water and continue to do what he loved to do. And so he was out probably about a year. I remember just watching him. The therapist would come, and he would do those exercises like you wouldn't believe. You know, they would tell him to do something, and he was by the book, determined to do it. You know, the therapist would tell him to walk 10 feet. He would try to walk 20. You know, he was just super determined to beat West Nile. And so, you know, he got to a point where he finally beat it. He was able to walk, and kind of like nothing happened. And so he finally was able to get back out on the water, And so just that time period that he was out with Wes now, like I remember going trawling with him for the first time since then, and he got out and he just was amazed at how much had changed. Like all his landmarks he used to know where he's at, like a lot of them washed away, and it's just unbelievable how fast the coast is changing.
So you mentioned that he started living a traditional way of life. Just for, people, our listeners who are not familiar with that, can you explain to us, like, what does that mean in terms of the United Houma Nation?
Yeah, so traditional way of life. He grew up in a palmetto hut house. The roofs of the house were made out of palmetto. The walls were made out of mud and moss. The mattresses were made out of moss, and come from family of fishermen. So they just lived off the land, trapping, fishing, shrimp, oysters.
So Jason, you mentioned that your grandfather was not permitted to go to school past the 7th grade due to segregation. Can you expound on that at all for us?
Yeah, so at the time before the 1960s, the Indian community wasn't allowed to go to the public schools. They couldn't go get a haircut anywhere. So they had their own community and were forced to kind of just rely on each other.
So you mentioned that your mother served in a lead role in the United Houma Nation. Was she permitted to get an education in our community?
Yeah, so she was the first year she went to school was the first year of desegregation. So she went to school like everyone else, but my grandmother would have to go to school frequently because my mom was getting called names and getting picked on. And if you know my grandmother, she had 2 artificial legs, and she didn't take anything from anyone. She would let you have it. She kind of grew up in New Orleans, so she had a little pizzazz to her. So she definitely was not okay with her daughter being picked on.
So Jason, coming from a traditional background, talk about what it was like growing up in this modern world.
Yeah, so growing up, it's kind of like I was walking in 2 different worlds. I was doing the things that a typical kid growing up would do. I'd play sports, but then on the weekends I would go to powwows and, talk to elders and learn how to do things like make blowguns, weave baskets. So it's just a unique situation when you're just kind of caught in the middle of a traditional world and a modern world.
So tell us, I understand now that you're oystering, and that's one of the trades that was kind of taught to you by your grandfather. Can you describe how, I understand nursing and oystering are kind of 2 maybe opposite or different career paths. Can you explain to us how you kind of got into that?
Yeah, so I just got kind of tired of wearing scrubs. now that we've lived off the land for hundreds of years, generation after generation. The natural environment has been good to us, and today it's just getting harder and harder to make that same living off the land that we've done for generation after generation. So, my grandfather never, even if I would have wanted to become a commercial fisherman out of high school, he would have not let me, just because he knew the industry, where it was going, and that it's a hard living catch to catch instead of paycheck to paycheck. So coming back now that I'm a nurse, got a career, just kind of carrying on the tradition of being a people of the land has been inspiring. So we were up in Seattle. I was doing a travel nurse contract there, and I saw some of my coworkers said, "Hey, let's go get oysters or check out this oyster farm." I was like, "Oyster farm? My grandfather's an oysterman." It's like, that sounds cool. So then I went there, and we saw how oysters are farmed instead of just caught wild. So I remember calling my grandfather and being like, "Hey, we just went to check out this oyster farm, and there's not a dredge involved. All the oysters they pick up are singles. They don't have a hatchet to break up a paquet." So he's like, "Cho, that sounds good." Whenever he would say something like that, you knew that was really good. So then he was all on board. So we started working on permits, and then it took about a year to get everything, like one of his leases, converted to farmable land. So we got the permit, and then for the past about 2 years, we've just been trying out different types of equipment and different things that'll work in our area on our leases. So it's been a little challenging. It's not as easy as you initially think.
So Jason, explain to us a little bit about your oyster farm.
Yeah, so it's Bayou Rosa Oyster Farm. That was my grandfather's favorite oyster lease, so that's where I got the name from. So we get the oyster seed from a hatchery, and we get the oysters. They're usually between 3 to 5 millimeters in size. And so what we do is we put it in a cage, and when they're that small, usually a cage within a cage, and then we put it out on the lease, and then every so often we pick up the cage, we sort the oysters, kind of clean them out. If crabs will get in, then they'll just eat every oyster you have. So we clean the oysters out, and then so over 6 to 9 months, they become mature and they're able to go to market.
So when you started doing oystering, you said that, you had proposed this idea to your grandpa about doing these oyster farms. Did he initially help you in your oystering endeavors?
Yeah, so it was a completely different type of oystering. So he wasn't able to, like, he didn't know about how to make cages and stuff like this, but he was right there by my side trying to help me any way possible. I was like, hey, Paul, you got an air compressor? Oh, yeah, I got an air compressor. So he was so happy to bring it to me. And if I needed a tool, he was there. We'd go to the store, like, oh, yeah, we need this. So he was like, it was new to him, but he was not going to let that stop him from helping out and, like, helping me to get started.
Right. I think we all can relate to having grandparents who push us and, want us to be better, and with the more opportunities that we're given. Talk to me about, I think it's really just no secret that in our community there is a stigma associated with being an American Indian. What are you doing in your efforts in nursing or oystering or just raising your son to stop that stigma?
Yeah, so we've come from such a strong background, and we've overcome so many obstacles throughout our history that to not be proud of who we are and what our ancestors have done for us, I just couldn't imagine, like one day, I'll be gone and my name's going to be on an ancestry chart, and they're going to look at my family history and they'll see Nanes was a traiteur. They'll see my grandmother who had artificial legs, but that didn't stop her from, like, serving on the consul and helping her people out. She would sign over her paycheck to keep the lights on in the tribal office when times were rough, just always giving back. They'll see my mom, who was principal chief and received numerous awards for her service to her people, and then my name's going to come up and they're going to be like, okay, what did he do to continue these legacies of everyone that's come before him, like, did all the knowledge of the herbs, the plants, the way of life, did all that stop there? Or, like, what did he do to help and give back to his people to make sure that, our legacy stays strong and that, Louis, my son, can know who he is without having to pick up a book and read about what's a traiteur, who's a Houma Indian. So that's kind of the motivation to keep the legacy going and to be proud of being a Houma tribal member.
So Jason, tell us, what does the future hold? What does it hold for Bayou Rosa Oyster Farm and your endeavors with the United Houma Nation?
And throughout history, we've shown a resiliency and an ability to adapt to an ever-changing environment. So I think our future is very promising, but it's going to be for people of my generation to show an interest and lead by example. Like, continue to talk to elders, like, hear stories about their upbringing and how they grew up, like more traditional way of life. And then we'll have to continue their legacy sometimes in non-traditional ways, like maybe not dredging for oysters, maybe farming them, so it's just going to be us as a people to adapt to the changing environment to make sure that the legacies and our identity stays and that, we don't forget who we are as a tribal people.
Absolutely. I'm so thankful that you're coming and sharing, your people's traditions and their heritage, because I think that the United Houma Nation is such a big part of Bayou Lafourche and the South Lafourche community. It really contributes to who we are as Cajuns. I feel like that's such a big portion of our community. So I don't know if you're familiar, but at the end of every show, we have a round of rapid fire questions related to life on the bayou. You can give us a one-word answer or expand on your answer if you feel the need to explain. So it's really up to you. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So what is your go-to order at a down the bayou restaurant?
I'd have to go with a shrimp po' boy dressed.
Hey, good choice. Potato salad, in the gumbo or on the side?
I guess it would depend on who made the gumbo and who made the potato salad. Sometimes not everybody's potato salad goes with this gumbo. So it's
good call.
I'm torn between the two.
So jambalaya, red or brown?
My dad cooked the best red jambalayas, so I'd have to go with red.
Good choice. What is your favorite Cajun French word or phrase and its meaning?
So the little story behind this one, it's gris-gris patassa. I remember playing basketball and we'd play the up the bayou teams, and you would say the gris-gris patassa, and they would look at you with the fear of God in their face. They didn't know what you were saying. So that's definitely my favorite go-to saying.
So what is your favorite snowball flavor?
Bubblegum.
Clear or blue?
I guess I'm traditional, go with blue. I like the blue lips and the blue tongue.
So now that you have a son, I'm betting that your wife goes for clear.
Oh, absolutely. He loves snowballs.
So our last one, when the boat is passing and you're in the core, is the bridge open or closed?
It's absolutely open for the vessel.
That is a highly controversial question that we enjoy getting feedback on. Okay, well, that'll do it for this episode of the DTB podcast. Thanks to our guest, Jason Pitre. We sincerely appreciate you and your wife's time today. You can subscribe to the DTB podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at the DTB podcast. You can also follow Bless Your Heart Nonprofit on Facebook or on Twitter at BYH Nonprofit. You can donate to Bless Your Heart on Venmo at Bless Your Heart Nonprofit and on PayPal at blessyourheartnonprofit@gmail.com. That'll wrap it up for us on the DTB podcast. Be sure to hit that subscribe button for our next episode. Until then, this is Jeray Jambon Jarreau. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.